Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this month's session of the Ummatics Colloquium. It gives me great pleasure to welcome a very noted scholar from the West in the realms of Islamic education, perhaps one of the preeminent scholars in the West in this arena. We will be talking, inshallah, about redefining Islamic education towards an Ummatic identity. The majority of Islamic education as practiced today is fundamentally based on secular perspectives of education. Islamic education is often reduced to a narrow understanding of the Sharia, excluding sciences, social sciences, and other specializations, leaving their content and perspectives and the perspectives through which they are taught under secular control. Consequently, Muslim students graduate facing a dichotomy: become an Islamic scholar with a limited focus on Sharia, mainly on fiqh and aqidah, or become a professional scientist, distancing themselves from the Sharia they studied, which appears irrelevant to their fields. However, Islam is intended to shape the Muslim perspectives on all aspects of life, including science, social science, and other fields. A Muslim architect should inherently consider urban design from an Islamic perspective, ensuring environmental preservation, privacy protection, and community enhancement. A Muslim political scientist should not fall into what the might is right fallacy, but should develop a worldview that fosters equality, cooperation, and freedom of belief rooted in the fundamental principles of Islam. With such a comprehensive understanding of Islamic education, the mindset of a Muslim graduate would bridge the gap between Sharia and secular specializations in the ideal. Sharia would become the foundation from which they comprehend the world, develop those new theories in different fields, and strive to improve it. The Ummah would then be more than a source of sympathy and belonging. It would be integral to the perspective and daily work of Muslim economists, doctors, and wider community members. In this context, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome a former colleague of mine. We worked together at the same institution many years ago now, Dr. Abdullah Shaheen, who is currently a reader at the University of Warwick in the field of education, and is, I would argue, very clearly the most prominent figure in the field of Islamic education in the UK, if not Europe as a whole. His academic journey is rooted in Islamic studies, theology, education studies, and social sciences. And he has dedicated his career to exploring religious identity formation among British Muslim youth. He's recognized for his efforts to develop the first recognized master's level degree program on Islamic education within the UK higher education system. His significant contributions include the book New Directions in Islamic Education, Pedagogy and Identity Formation, and he has been actively involved in research and teaching at various prestigious institutions. I would like to add that he has a very cosmopolitan background, being of Turkish heritage originally, but having lived in the Arabian Gulf and been educated there for many years, and so speaks fluent Arabic as well as being fully conversant with the ulum Sharia. So it gives me great pleasure, Dr. Shaheen, to welcome you to speak of or speak about redefining Islamic education towards an Ummatic identity. And the floor is yours, inshallah, for the next 40 minutes. I understand you may take a little less than that, but the floor is yours, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Saleh. I hope I am audible. You can hear me.
Sorry, your mic, I think, is a little unclear. I think your mic has changed from what it was earlier. Is it possible to switch to the original mic? Now we can't hear you. So basically, if you go to audio settings, so if you, and you can, unfortunately, we still can't hear you. This is a...
Sorry, Saleh, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Okay, yes, please.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alhamdulillah ala din al-Islam wa tawfiq al-Iman wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you today, Usama, and all of your audiences spread across the world, I believe. It's a very kind invitation from the Ummatics Institute. I'm happy that I will be able to share some of my ideas on rethinking Islamic education within the sensibilities of being part of a global Ummah, inshallah. I would like to offer my apologies because we did actually try hard to get the PowerPoint shared with audiences, but we wouldn't be able to do that, unfortunately. So I will be able to go through my slides, if you allow me, and share my thoughts. And if there's a need, we can perhaps later on share with the listeners, viewers separately, inshallah. So this is an interesting topic. It's very close to my heart, as Brother Osama mentioned. I've been working on Islamic education for quite a long time now, and trying to redefine Islamic education towards an Ummatic identity is a highly interesting way of posing the question, I would say. So what I will do, I hope that our encounter today will be a form of what we call learning from knowing one another type of activity, which in Islamic tradition, as you know, we call it ta'aruf. So the word ta'aruf is a very important pedagogic educational concept in the Quran. And I'm hoping that ta'aruf is not simply knowing one another, but being open to learn from each other. And I hope that this space today will help us to enrich, inshallah, our understanding, knowledge of the topic. So it will be a form of, inshallah, good ta'aruf. I have 4 main points that I would like to cover. First of all, rethinking Islamic education. The question is why? Why do we need to rethink? Second major area that I would like to cover is discovering education in Muslim tradition. Again, here the question is how? How do we actually discern meaning of education in complex Islamic traditions that we have inherited? So this is a methodological question. And the final question I'm trying to address, which is related to the above both, that is, how could we redefine Islamic education within the Ummatic self-awareness? And that Islamic education, which will have social, political, civic goals. And the question is what that kind of Islamic education look like in reality. And then we'll have some conclusions reached, hopefully by then, and then question and answers. Now, before I go into covering these 4 main points, I would like to slightly deviate and maybe share my own, I suppose, research journey to create the wider context, the background within which I have been grappling with these questions. There may be some of the audiences who are probably not familiar with my work. So I will briefly share some of my previous research relevant to the questions we are posing today. So last almost 2 decades now, I've been really trying to grapple with a broader question, that is, what does it mean to be educated Islamically in the modern world? So I was trying to really find some answers, myself being a Muslim, student of Islam, ilm, and of course, moving from a Muslim majority context to a Muslim minority context of UK. So this question has always really grappled my mind. That is, how do we define the process of being Islamically educated within the current conditions? And as a way of unpacking this complex question, when I looked at the literature, I realized there isn't really much empirical studies. There are plenty of theoretical, conceptual studies talking about crisis in Ummah, education, identity, but less these arguments, these discussions were informed by rigorous empirical research. So my journey began to actually first pose this question as an empirical study, and the study was constructed around exploring the question, how do British Muslim young people, which is my context, people construct their sense of belonging within culturally and religiously plural secular British society. And the second sub-question I was looking at was, to what extent secular education and community-based Islamic education respond to the changing needs of British Muslim young people? How can Islamic education spaces become inspiring, empowering, and transformative catalysts for positive change in Muslim majority and minority societies? These were the main questions I was really trying to address. And the result of this journey, which has been really almost 10 years, I'll share some of that empirical research soon. The result of these inquiries were really is the necessary really need to rethink educational theory and pedagogic practice of education in Islamic societies today. So I felt the need to rethink based on these empirical studies. Before I go to actually just briefly share what I found in these empirical studies, which has compelled me to revisit theology, politics, philosophy of education in Islam, I would like to just mention the fact that we have to be aware of the wider context within which we are raising these questions to do with education, nature of Islamic education, and its limitations, and how it can be actually reconstructed, reformed. So we have to look at the wider picture if we are going to problematize, rethink Islamic education. And what is the wider contextual challenge? We have to look at how Islamic education is functioning, has been functioning within the emerging post-colonial community formation across the Islamic world. It's a historical context. We have to look at how Islam Muslims have become increasingly defined by the Western secular liberal values of education. You like or you dislike, this is kind of sociological observations, really. And the fact that we are living through persisting coloniality, that is Islamophobia, extremism, and increasingly securitized sense of framing, policies of framing Islam and Muslims across the globe, not only in Europe, but also in Muslim majority countries. So this wider historical, sociological, political context is important to bear in mind when we are engaging internally to find out what is education in Islam, why is it working or not working, how could we actually make it a transformative catalyst. So the outcomes really have been the last almost nearly a century now, post-colonial process. We have, sadly, secular religious dichotomy in education spaces, creating incompatible mindsets, different approaches to become educated or being an intellectual, in fact. Failure of secular education reform, neoliberal, I suppose, hegemony of higher education spaces in Islamic world in the name of modernization. And similarly, sadly, failure of religious revival renewal attempts, which gave us, this whole complex process gave us, sadly, a very narrow definition of Islamic education. In fact, the word Islamic education itself is a kind of a modern term. We don't have such a concept in Islamic tradition as such, because in Islam we will discover it is a holistic view, worldview, where religious, non-religious doesn't really make much more sense. However, Islamic education emerged without probably noticing by the early renewal reformist thinkers, Muslims, who were trying to naturally, of course, respond to the invading colonial Western secular education. But they didn't realize, in my view, by doing such a reactionary definition, they were actually narrowing Islamic education as a kind of a traditional instruction-centered model of knowledge transmission, ilm transmission, detached from the wider world, sadly. So now I kind of go back to my particular empirical research, in which I wanted to really test how traditional forms of Islamic education are producing identity formations. And that I was examining this within the context of British Muslim communities. Again, despite the politics of the context, you can actually assess any educational activity and its impact on formation of character, personality, attitudes, behaviors. That is probably the best way to assess whether an educational system is working or not working. I say this politics of education is crucial because not only we have these political constraints, but also in my context, which is Muslim minority context, education, particularly religious education, is used by particularly parental, authority essentially to reproduce certain identity narratives borrowed from the country of origin of the parents. So we have to understand the limitations or the constraints are not simply from the secular state apparatus, but also within the community where Islamic education is used as a kind of a tool, really, to recreate what they think is the ideal way of being a Muslim. And often it is actually mixed with culture, it mixed with indigenous cultural ways of actually behaving and forming identities. So within that process, usually the changing realities of the learner themselves are missed out, are not part of the actual process of rethinking education. So we have to be fair and say that that actually has happened in the case of many British Muslim communities and wider minority communities where education is used as a parental way of really control reproduction of the same identity narratives. So you won't be able to see, unfortunately, I have actually developed a model of assessing identity formation, which is a psychosocial instrument. However, it has a theology behind it. Yet again, I won't be able to share this, but this model obviously is crucial to be able to generate evidence. And this identity model assumes formation of identities alongside poles of commitment and exploration. So if you have an identity formation that is based on reflection, exploration, search, where the outcome would be usually an exploratory type of identity, which is psychologically healthy, it enables the individual agency to come through. But the opposite of this process could happen where you have a very strong presence of identity formation based on simply unreflective commitment, emulation, and of obviously certain value systems where we don't have presence of learner's agency. That is called foreclosed identity formation. So when we applied this model, yet again, this model is based on a theoretical framework which has Islamic as well as sort of secular social science background into it, but I won't be able to share, as I said, you can read later on if you wish, in much more detail, inshallah. So when we applied this instrument, essentially, what we found out, third, fourth generation of British Muslim young people are very keen on maintaining emotional ties with Islam. But when you unpack this emotional commitment, you realize actually there isn't much in terms of knowledge, understanding, or being able to contextualize Islamic knowledge in their lives or as a piece of historical knowledge of Islam in the past. Now, that is an important indication that the kind of Islamic educational practices we are offering to young people in the mosque, madrasa, Darul Uloom, are all appear to be actually forming foreclosed mindsets. Clearly, this is an empirical hypothesis. It could be challenged, of course. I am aware of this. But the fact is we have enough evidence that there is this pedagogic culture of taqlid, emulation without reflection, that unfortunately turns the entire educational process into a form of indoctrination, instruction, mere knowledge transmission. And that is producing not only foreclosed type of Muslim identities, but they're also sadly creating foreclosed type of leadership models. So a student of Sharia, for example, is studying, becoming a leader, but unaware that this leadership model is actually based on a very narrow understanding of Islamic heritage, and of course a very narrow sense of being a leader in a different context. So based on this evidence, I felt the need to rethink what education is in Islam. So unless we are clear about actually how education is defined in Muslim tradition, or unless we really are able to qualify education Islamically, obviously we cannot respond to this problem, because it is possible that maybe education in Islam is nothing but mere nurture and knowledge transmission. Maybe that is the case. So the question is, does Islamic heritage, Islamic sources have a very sophisticated perception of educational vocabulary, educational goals, and educational vision? Now, these questions in my view, when I looked at the literature, were not really systematically addressed. And that has led me to problematize the way in which we discern what education is in Islam first. Because if we don't do this benefit of doubt, the chances are we will assume what education is. And let's be frank, education is a field where everybody really thinks they are experts because it's such a part of all human life. But the fact is, of course, now we study education sciences as separate discipline. So the question is, how do we discern education in Islam? Is a methodic question. And the literature, when you look at the literature on Islam and education, produced sometimes by secular social scientists, sometimes by scholars of Sharia sciences only. And of course, their answers, showed conflict, but it wasn't underpinned by a firm, rigorous methodological framing. And this is an epistemological problem, actually. And I decided to develop what I call a method, which can be really called a kind of educational pedagogic hermeneutics applied to Islamic core sources, which is distinct from, let us say, political readings of Islam or philosophical readings of Islam. So I felt we need to really construct a distinctive educational reading framework in which we could claim that we are able to discern meaning of education in core Islamic sources properly. So the literature shows plenty of disciplinary limitations. As I said, the literature is usually produced by scholars in Sharia sciences who are unaware of social sciences, or social sciences unaware of actually Sharia sciences. So there's a big problem. And of course, the third type of literature, what I call inspirational literature, it is based on basically commitment to pass on Islam to young generations, mostly by practitioners in Islamic schooling contexts, where obviously you can't expect theoretical rigorousness or thinking as such. But that is the third type of literature. All of which could be obviously misleading because it could be based on an inadequate understanding of what education is in Islam. So I decided to dedicate my career really, after that point, to what I call the formation of Islamic education studies. And I realized Sharia sciences and education sciences are crucial to get this integration and, of course, understanding and assessing the educational challenges, crises facing Muslim communities. Without such a discipline, Islamic education will be an afterthought, either theological studies or just an afterthought of education studies, or maybe some ethnographers who are keen on to understand the changing nature of religious authority, spiritual authority within complex Muslim societies across the West, for example. But this kind of ethnographic studies will be interesting, but they will lack really proper theorizing what education is in Islam. Now, when we applied this educational hermeneutics, I won't go into much more detail. I realized if you look at the Quran itself, the Quran is actually, it contains a very sophisticated self-perception of education. And my really favorite concept, which probably is well known to all of the audiences probably, is the word Tarbiyah. Tarbiyah is a word that is common to all Islamic languages, an Arabic word, but it is used in Urdu, Turkish, Kurdish, in many settings. But this word has obviously evolved, and people have forgotten to ask the origins of this word and what actually it means in terms of its educational pedagogic qualities. Now, Tarbiyah, as you know, is linked with Rabb, which is theologically very interesting. We have Rububiyyah. But in short, when you unpack the perception of Tarbiyah in Islamic tradition, for example, 11th, 10th century scholar Raghib al-Isfahani, in his dictionary, Mufradat al-Quran, he has an entry on Rabb, for example. He simply says, Al-Rabbu fil asli Tarbiyah, and he says, what is Tarbiyah? Tarbiyah insha'u shay'i halan fa halan ila haddi tamam. To be able to form something gradually until it fulfills its potentials. So here we have a very interesting conception of education linked to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qualities, and it is defined as a gradual process of fulfilling, actualizing one's potentials. And notice the word Tarbiyah is not qualified Islamic, un-Islamic. Scholar says basically Tarbiyah, which gives us shumuli, inclusive perception of education. But here the word, the scholar emphasizes, has three distinctive meanings. That is, every act of Tarbiyah has to be a process of growth, development. It has to be an act of reform, gradually improving your condition. And it has to be an act of leadership, guiding. So it is care, growth, nurture, looking after, lead, and continuously reform. So you have a dynamic conception of education unfolding in Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you know, in the early revelations, introduces himself as actually Rabb al-Alameen, educator of all worlds. Now, again, we don't have time to go into this. In order to build up an educational theory based on the dynamic, inclusive concept of Tarbiyah, you have to look at how the Quran sees human nature, because there is no educational theory without understanding human nature, fatra. So as you know, the Quran has a very highly clarified, sophisticated conception of human nature. But in essence, Quranic view of human nature exactly goes hand in hand with the developmental Tarbiyah concept. That is, human nafs, as we are told, is developmental, and human nafs actually, through right education, can fulfill its potentials. As you all know, Prophet Quran has famously declares, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا أَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. The Quran puts human agency in terms of it is critical education, critical tarbiyah basically. So tarbiyah not only is a developmental process, caring, nurturing, looking after, but it's also an inevitably critical process of change, facilitating change. So my translation of the word tarbiyah in English, in my view, the best it could be, compassionate transformation. I do believe that that the word tarbiyah actually could best be understood facilitating compassionate transformation. That is transformation, change, positive change, with care, with respect, with tolerance and inclusion of the learner. So if you apply this tarbiyah as the Quranic transformative educational vision, then you have obviously all other concepts underpinning this process. Ilm, tazkiyah, hikmah, all of these concepts, the Quranic concepts, gives us actually a transformative model of human development. Now here we have to look at in much more detail. It looks like Quranic educational model is actually, unlike what people assume, it is not really instruction teacher-centered. It is actually a learner-led process because the teacher is there for the learner. It's holistic. It doesn't divide human experience into spiritual, non-spiritual, religious, non-spiritual. And it always engaged with a process, continuous reform, islah or iflah. So in other words, ultimately the Quranic educational model wants to help humanity fulfill its potentials, what the ancient Greeks called achieve a good life, but also at the same time recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's oneness and be able to offer thanks, gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and live a life of gratitude. So it is really very complex theory of education is embedded in the Quran and applied to the Sunnah, prophetic practice. And those who wish to read more about this, I call this cloud and grass theory of education in Islam, because the imagery, the metaphors used in Arabic and Islamic tradition with the tarbiyah are all to do with vegetation, unfolding, growth, and development. So the point is, how could we now get this compassionate transformation linked with the creation of a new sense of ummatic awareness? Now, so far, education is understood to be quite, individualistically. It's highly personalist, which is correct in a way that the Quran deals with individual human soul, tries to reform and transform the individual soul. But what is often neglected is the fact that the Quranic educational model is highly political and social in character. It doesn't want to have individuals simply trying to get individual sense of salvation as such. But the Quran wants healthy human beings in a healthy society, basically. And without creating a healthy polity, you won't be able to actually keep these healthy individuals. So the Quranic education shows very strong social focus that is primarily focused on justice issues, inclusion, socioeconomic, egalitarian way of life, respect, dignity. You will see the Quran is engaged in what we call kind of public education. So the notion that Tarbiyah is individualistic is probably misleading in this sense. It is really showing a very strong socio-political intention. Without actually changing the society, obviously, ultimately, you won't be able to maintain these good human beings who are functioning in a healthy context. So the Quran has high interest in addressing socio-political economic problems, without which you can't really get these individuals. So the Quranic education begins with a critique of the social context, if there are inequalities. And we can only really address these inequalities if we are able to fulfill at individual level the fundamental goals of Islam. So there is, in a way, a social political dimension to Islamic education. It's a public figure, and that goes back to the very notion of what it means to be religious according to Quranic worldview. So remember, the word deen and tadayyun are the key words here. Ultimately, deen and tadayyun actually could be translated into English as developing a sense of responsibility, an ethical sense of responsibly living towards oneself, one's neighbor, society, and environment, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all of these go hand in hand with the fundamental vision of education in the Quran. And of course, finally, we can consider Tawheed as the ultimate concept here, because Tawheed also gives us a sense of inclusiveness, interdependence, and integration. Because Tawheedi worldview is a worldview which is holistic. There is no division or subdivision or categorization of religious and non-religious. So Tawheed, the word Tawheed complements this dynamic, inclusive educational model that has not only a focus on individual purification, but fundamentally is interested in creating just polities, just socioeconomic settings, so that obviously all human beings could have a dignified life, a quality of life, happiness that everybody deserves. And of course, ultimately, a humanity that is not only showing gratitude towards oneself, but also recognizing that they have to also show gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by worshiping Him alone. So Tawheed is our final concept, and here it's really highlights achieving an interdependent, inclusive worldview, where we try to find harmony and integration among the complex diversity of the creation. Now, if you look at today, obviously, the Ummatic thinking, we have to problematize the word Ummah and Ummatic. We have to bear in mind that Ummah is complex, diverse. Hence, education, to create a sense of being part of the Ummah, has to be inclusive, tolerating diversity, and addressing difference of color, race, gender, and I don't even have time to engage with particular gender. We all know how the gender gap actually exists within Islamic education settings, sadly. So in order to create Ummatic real identity and link this with Islamic education, we have to reconnect with this transformative Islamic educational model, I believe is in the Quran. And we need to obviously challenge the current epistemic assumptions, the profit exploitation-driven logic of neoliberal education, which sadly is all over the Islamic world. But also we have to engage openly with pedagogies of taqlid within Islamic education settings. This could be Islamic schooling, it could be seminary, or it could be hybrid Islamic higher education, like the one we have in the West now springing up. So ultimately, we need to embed these practices into justice-focused, inclusive, integrative, and transformative education in Islam at the heart of the Ummatic awareness and identity formation. So with this positive word, I would like to now end my talk. I've got a reminder from Brother Osama. I've got 10 minutes left. I don't have time. If those who are interested, you could actually tap into the web. I do teach a course on this transformative Islamic education model at Warwick, and we do have a fully fledged graduate program on this very model. Those who wish to examine, they could examine. I'm very pleased that I have been supported in this work with several British Muslim family trusts that are really interested and believe in, committed to creating this Islamic education to become space to become transformative and to produce a new leadership that is actually reconnected with this transformative vision of education at the heart of Islam. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. So I would like to now pass on to Brother Osama to moderate, and if there are any questions, I would like to obviously respond and engage, inshallah.
Really, it's been a pleasure to sort of listen to actually an aspect, a snapshot of some of your work, because you've been doing this work for a long time and you've written in a number of other areas which you've also kind of hinted at elements of, whether it's notions of decolonization, a critical pedagogy, and reflecting, I think, on also how this is embedded within the Islamic scholarly tradition. So, going back to authoritative figures, lexicographers like Raghib al-Isfahani, when thinking about the word Tarbiyah as well. And I think, before I continue, I should remind people that you are welcome to ask questions. They will show up on our chat. If you put questions in the chat, we'll try and address as many of them as possible in the upcoming discussion, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But I wanted to highlight a couple of points that you made, which in some respects perhaps could lead on to a further discussion of, on the theme of drawing on education as a tool for ummatic re-enlivening, or bringing the ummah to think as an ummah. First, I wanted to point out, you noted that Islamic education as a category or as a term is a modern term. And it made me think, a point I sometimes reflect on as well, Islamic studies as a category is a modern term. So studies comes out of like I guess in the German tradition they use Wissenschaft or something like this, but it basically categorizes things as a science, and therefore it is legitimate and it must be secular in its outlook in order for it to be considered Islamic studies. Otherwise you should go to a theology faculty and you're all subjectivists there and none of your knowledge is objective, so to speak. So those sorts of positivist prejudices, which are deeply embedded within our sort of educational institutions' classification of knowledge and what is valuable and what is not valuable, and is reflected in the policymakers and the way in which they prioritize primary, secondary education before it gets even to the level at which you and I are addressing these questions. I think that creates an extremely challenging environment for us to then ask these fundamental questions about the nature of Islamic education when we are in this kind of condition of coloniality as minority communities in the West, or as Muslims in the East, or in the other parts of the world, Muslim majority parts of the world. And so I guess that to a certain extent is a comment on the what you've described in other writing of yours as the essential quality of being critical in our reflections on Islamic education. So that was one comment I wanted to add. And in addition to that, I think drawing on the historical continuities and disjunctures is quite an important dimension of this. So when we quote medieval authors, I wonder to what extent, and this is something which is in your area of specialization, and so it's a question to you more than I don't have very much to contribute here in a sense, but when someone like Raghib al-Isfahani is talking about education, obviously we don't have the technological, bureaucratic, or other means, and we don't have nation states that mandate, for example, compulsory education or compulsory primary education on a mass scale. This is only possible after the print revolution. It's only possible also now with the communications revolution, and so education is something akin. One would argue. I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. to a form of indoctrination in the Foucauldian paradigm of forming subjects for purposes of governmentality, for creating good citizens who are just going to obey the rules and know where their limits are. In that sort, and it's an extremely powerful model. Again, to quote Foucault a little, it reinforces the panopticon, the ability of the state to surveil everyone and keep them all in check. We don't have that in the pre-modern world. It's not possible to enact anything like this. So when we think of education, are we thinking somewhat anachronistically in terms of the great ulama like Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi'i, or the great muhaddithin and the great scholars of ilm al-kalam? These actually quite elite, select groups who are able to access knowledge, but we don't actually have a category of mass education. I mean, just by virtue of the reality of society at those times. And so are we in the process, the necessary process and the inevitable process of inventing tradition at this point in time that is commensurate and as is speaking to a longer tradition of pedagogy, which is somewhat more elitist, but now we have to think about multiple levels, primary, secondary, tertiary, where it gets a bit more elite of education. And what challenges and opportunities, the Ummatic question here is, and that's ultimately, the purpose of the Ummatics Colloquium, to think about redirecting our intellectual efforts towards Ummatic questions. The Ummatic question here is, how do we utilize modern resources, modern technologies, modern knowledges, so to speak, in a way that will help us enliven Islamic civilization and perhaps rediscover and reinvent our own traditions in cases where we have a relatively thin source base for thinking specifically about contemporary global geopolitical structures and the like. Very long-winded question and earlier comment, but I hope that this is an interesting and useful point of starting off our discussion. And I'm sure we've already got a few questions coming in, but we will try and address those. Please keep the questions coming in, but I want to give the floor to you, Dr. Shaheen, inshallah.
Yes, these are good observations and good actually question. It is true, of course, we should be aware of the anachronism that is possible, that we could read back into the tradition, today's problems. However, if you look at the textual evidence and the historical evidence, we have to look at, in the case of Islamic civilization, how political economics of ilm functioned. The word ilm is crucial now. In fact, when we sort of survey key concepts in Islam that will be corresponding to what we roughly mean education today, probably the word ilm is usually the first to picked up, because you've got so much reference to ilm, ahlul ilm, and bearers of knowledge, sacred knowledge, and how these bearers of knowledge moderated different expectations, and of course, most crucially, different power relations. In fact, this has been an interest of mine in the last 2 papers I have written about the concept of knowledge in Islam and the knowledge bearers, ulama. So when we look at from this angle, we can actually see power relations are moderated with ilm, with education, what we call. In fact, very early on, what we recognize, it wasn't a nation state, but it was certainly a political apparatus and power, dynasty framework, for example. They realized the importance of ilm and ahlul ilm, ulama, in terms of legitimizing, isn't it, political actually regimes, if you like. So this is not really anachronism, it's a reality, and we know that people have resisted to this, people of true bearers of knowledge, and that is probably what I call personalist civic framing of education in early Islam. We are very pleased to see that actually a core group of Muslim scholars have maintained independence by refusing to be having patronage and control of the political power. But nevertheless, ilm, ahlul ilm, were part of this process, and we have studies on this, as you know. In fact, you would be surprised, the first institutionalization of education, madrasa, in Islamic civilization is actually manifestation of this power control, and the Seljuks, creating this as a response to the Shiite challenge or Fatimite challenge, because they were training their dais to attack, I suppose, within the Batini ideology with the Sunni world. So it is actually, it is part of human life, and we have evidence for this. But the fact that we have scholars who realize this exploitation and abuse, and they try to maintain their independence, and that in fact gave us Islamic civilization, what I call Islamic civic imaginary, as opposed to imperial imaginary. When you become an empire, the chances are you will develop institutions, regime control. And in Islam, of course, Islamic education history, this has happened. And of course, the Ottomans probably were the last who have institutionalized, completely annexed independent ulama with the government control. So the point is, we have to go back, look at the tradition to see how scholars maintain that independence, and they become agents of moderation between the state and the various public functions. Unfortunately, today, our ulama, by and large, there are studies in the Muslim majority context and the minority context, are no longer agents of moderating power. On the other way around, they are actually sadly being exploited by various political interests. This could be state interests in the Gulf, various ideologies, or in the Muslim minority context, representing the interest of the transnational religious movements, sadly. And of course, I don't even count so-called ulama who are advancing secular liberal reconstruction of Islam in Europe. That is kind of politically correct versions of ulama. So ilm and bearers of ilm and the politics have always been hand in hand, sadly. But we have this fundamental tradition in the Quran that is the critical awareness, that actually through critique, evidence-based thinking, the ulama are supposed to be maintaining that space of independence. And sadly, we don't have institutions today who are able to produce this. In fact, we have institutions where largely they are compartmentalizing the legacy. And the ulamas are already colored not only by political inclinations, but also by typical religiosities that tend to be either spiritual or reformist or XYZ. So yes, this intersection between ilm, alim, knowledge bearers, and the politics is a very crucial one. And I've dedicated the last two of my actually works on this, and hopefully a book is coming out on the concept of who is a scholar, how do we qualify a scholar in Islamic framework and in secular framework. And I have tried to revisit this, and I was amazed to discover how in Islamic tradition these debates were taking place actually, and ulama being aware of the pitfalls and how they develops actually critical pedagogies to avoid this. But nevertheless, it is true. Traditional Islam as well as today's Islam. And this is part of the problem of why we don't have transformative Islamic leadership developing really in the West, sadly.
Jazakumullah khair. I mean, I think the question that you raise about your book specifically is actually one of the crucial questions of our time. Like, what counts as a scholar, or what counts as an alim? I look forward to reading that, inshallah. I think someone was asking about, Farhana Qureshi is asking, where do I find the work of Dr. Shaheen, and so I can further read, and also contact info for regarding your program that you mentioned. So perhaps you can give us some.
Yes, well, the book is available on obviously internet, The New Directions in Islamic Education. You can actually access to that, and the short course I teach called Postgraduate Award in Islamic Education. And if you go to University of Warwick website, and I can share actually the link as we talk in the chat. This is a short 10 weeks course. It can be taken online. You can go through this model in much more detail. It's open to overseas students as well. It's a short PGA course. So that is a kind of link I can share in a minute, inshallah. So this Postgraduate Award in Islamic Education is the first of its kind and offered at University of Warwick. And will share the actual link, inshallah. And we do have a fully fledged master's program. If you wish to continue, you could actually progress into PG Cert and a full MA in Islamic education studies. And that is quite a new development, inshallah. But I will share the link, Sister Farhana.
So what will probably happen is if you share the link in the private chat, and I think the Ummatics admin can share it on
Yes.
the YouTube chat. Jazakumullah khairan. I would also point out, if I may, Dr. Shaheen, that your name on the Warwick website is spelt in the Turkish way. So there's an S-A-H-I-N. So if you Google Abdullah Shaheen, but spelling it with the single S of the Turkish, then
right.
You'll be able to find it online as well, inshallah. Where your publications, I believe, are also all listed and potentially linked as well under the publication.
Yes, absolutely.
Barakallahu feekum. So, I mean, there are a lot of questions, some looking historically, some looking actually contemporary. I wonder if you have, we'll try and take different ones of these, inshallah. But someone was asking about contemporary curricula, saying, what are your thoughts on developing an international curriculum like the International Baccalaureate for high schools from an Islamic and Ummatic perspective, or from an Islam, in terms of Islamic institutions? And perhaps I could add to that. This is a conversation I was having earlier with actually my wife, with whom I often have conversations regarding my scholarship. And I was saying that the people who decide which universities are ranked in the top of the system are based at institutions in Europe, in North America, and increasingly now in China as well. So it's the most powerful geopolitical actors globally that can produce those sorts of sort of rankings that allow to, the placing. What I always notice is the British league tables always over exaggerate the importance of our institutions. And I think there is a place. I wonder what you think of the role of ranking tables in the politics of international institutional power, and the giving of importance to certain forms of education, certain institutional norms when it comes to education on a global scale, and what Muslims have to do, in a sense, to test in that space as well. I hope that helps as a question, or makes sense. So the original question was about the international sort of like curricula and developing international curricula. That was
That's a very good question. In fact, obviously those who are aware of Islamic schooling sort of communities, networks, and also Islamic higher education networks, we obviously have to bear in mind that we often have syllabuses, really, texts to be studied. We don't really have an awareness that curriculum actually is a different concept. And that's therefore, I would say, from the knowledge that I have of the field, we don't really yet have a properly formed modern Islamic curriculum that integrates this transformative vision of education in Islam. So in fact, we don't have curriculum at all. But we have teaching resources, textbooks, and that is lack of familiarity with educational vocabulary, sadly. So we desperately need specialism in educational theory as well as practice, where we can actually be creative. And I call this lack of creativity in educational thinking in Islam, sadly, today. Despite the fact that we have a very complex, sophisticated inheritance of education, today, when you look at the education scene, even practice like Islamic schooling, sadly, we don't have that creativity reflecting. What we have is emulation of certain Western secular models, short courses, materials. So there's a very much need to create a modern Islamic curriculum, definitely from not only schools, but also for Islamic higher education. The question of what counts as scholar, for example, depends on how we are producing scholars. If the educational pedagogic process is the same, narrow, focused on certain texts simply, clearly the kind of leadership we are producing is going to be very narrow in outcome, sadly. And yes, we could actually have something like International Baccalaureate kind of Islamic curriculum that reflects Islamic vision of education, but also integrates what today counts as secular knowledge, not simply buy into it, but actually critiques it. It creates a space for the learners to engage with these different types of knowledge. Sadly, we don't have such creative curriculum development initiatives. We have smaller initiatives. I've seen in the chat somebody referred to late Dawood, I think brother Dawood, I forget his surname now. In America, he had some ideas about Tarbiyah that I've talked about.
Dawood Tawhidi.
Tawhidi, that's right. So these are actually very limited, sadly. He didn't have time to develop his vision. But I think he realized he was frustrated with the existing limitations, and his passion of the Quran, I think, led him to understand that. So he kind of stumbled upon the right concept, but I don't think he has actually turned into a proper curriculum framework. So we do need such creative initiatives. And I don't want to even mention, we do have almost now 30, 40 years of renewing Islamic education under the umbrella of Islamization of knowledge. Some of you probably have heard of this. Unfortunately, I have some criticism towards that initiative, although it came out of pious intentions, definitely. But none of the actors involved in that process were really technically qualified educational scholars. Neither were Sharia scholars as such, sadly. To say this is enough to understand as to why that process hasn't created really new Islamic curriculum, sadly. So yes, that's why I have this Islamic education studies program at the Western University, where we have faculty of education colleagues who are secular, definitely, but in Islam we have no problem in actually critiquing and engaging with dialogue with such expertise. As long as we know who we are, there's no problem. In fact, we need such expertise to liaise and exchange experiences with us, because we believe that, as we mentioned in Islam, the word Tarbiyah is an inclusive way of looking at education, and it's a responsible way of looking at education, not bifurcation. So clearly, it is through such rigorous academic framing and platforms where we have Sharia scholars hand in hand with social science and humanities that are actually working on these important pedagogic educational tasks. Without such integration, I think it's very difficult to produce what we call this inclusive curriculum. And what will happen? Islamic education will turn into, sadly, instruction, mere instruction, knowledge transmission, and sometimes, in fact, indoctrination. And remember, Islam has a very sophisticated vocabulary. You will be amazed to find out, although this vocabulary seems to be modern, John Dovey and then Paulo Ferrari come up with, but as I study with my students, we discover Islamic heritage has already got this concept. It's a very nuanced way of looking at what it means to be educated person. Very refined way, very complex. So Islam does have these nuances. What most parents, Muslim activists are involved, sadly, is a form of instruction, transmission of knowledge, or sadly sometimes indoctrination, which obviously fails to produce what we need, is socially responsible, politically aware sense of being part of worldwide Muslim community.
I'd love to ask you, I mean, I don't want to sort of monopolize the questions because there are lots of them coming in. But if we have time later on, I'd love to ask you, carefully distinguish between what you described as instruction, indoctrination, and I think one other term that you used. But no need to deal with that right now if we have time, inshallah. Mukhtar Ola Kunle, I hope I've pronounced your last name correctly, asks, I think, an important question, which it's one of the early questions. Would teaching quote unquote secular subjects like mathematics, science, or language, etc., be different or the same as non-Muslim institutions or non-Islamic institutions within an Islamic paradigm? So I guess this is like you are dealing with meta-theoretical questions within Islamic education, but I think some of those sort of more practical, pragmatic questions, I'd be very interested to see if you or your students have actually explored those implications very explicitly. I think you've done a lot of work in British schools as well, so I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's good. Obviously, this, when we say education in Islam is holistic, that is inclusive of all types of knowledge genres. What we classify as science today has to be part of, clearly, the Islamic curriculum, definitely. Now, the actual subject specialisms, as classical Muslim scholars qualified, they call it maratib al-ulum, the different types of knowledge. Clearly, each knowledge genre has its own subject specialism. So maths, in its essence, will not be different from a secular or Islamic way. That was a problem of Islamization of knowledge. You can't simply take the Western science and simply put Islamic before it. It becomes Islamic. It's not like this, of course. But how do a Muslim educator would position him or herself vis-a-vis what we call secular science? Well, first of all, we question the epistemic assumptions. Why should we actually think Islamic, non-Islamic in the first place? Because the knowledge that is produced is specialism. For example, understanding of the nature. This is an important requirement from the Quran, that Muslims, the faithful, are supposed to be discerning knowledge from how nature works, so that they could create awareness that there is creator behind it. So the technical knowledge probably will not be different, but Islamically made meaningful. That is a crucial task. How Muslim scientists see his or her task as a mission in this sense. So since knowledge is produced by human beings, we have to understand the limitations. I'll attach to that process. But the knowledge we are producing is supposed to be having a pedagogic goal of deepening our awareness, right living, just living, generally improving quality of life. If that knowledge is not doing, in other words, as Muhammad says, if it is not ilm nafi', remember ilm is nakira, could be any ilm, not simply religious, non-religious. So that scientific or non-scientific will not make any sense. So in other words, we have to really reposition our fundamental epistemic questions first. Once we have that awareness, we've got to turn this into a teacher training program. By the way, we don't have really programs where we can qualify Muslim educators, sadly. What we have is simple PGCE courses where you have secular subjects mastered. So if we deepen our awareness of what is knowledge, how do we produce knowledge specialisms, but then what's knowledge for, these questions will give us an Islamic way of framing entire knowledge genres that include scientific, religious, aesthetic, ethics, and ultimately this knowledge is supposed to be transforming, changing, facilitating tangible, really positive outcome. It's not for its own sake, basically. And in this sense, yes, we could say that all science could be made sense Islamically, and that could be actually put into a teacher training program and a curriculum framework.
So, I mean, there is a tag on to that question, but I'll come to that in a moment. Just to ask, again, a bit of a pragmatic question, but it has a theoretical bent to it as well. We live in a context where there is a hegemonic understanding of science versus non-science. And there are hegemonic understandings of certain types of, what counts as education. And in a sense, what you're doing is trying to disrupt that hegemonic understanding through an Islamically inspired discourse. Am I right in assuming that, this will succeed or fail on the basis of the uptake of that discourse, presumably by lots of Muslims advocating for a similar position, arguing, developing the discourse, creating a great nuanced body of literature that will then start to, filter down to these teacher training programs? Some of our questions may be a bit premature when we're asking for the pragmatic side of things, when we haven't done the discursive digging and formulating of the very rich tradition of discourse before we can answer those sorts of detailed questions. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is fair, and that is what is really lacking. We need to divert all of these efforts into a kind of a specialist platform in a way that actually are producing tangible outcomes. And it's not becoming a simplistic way of putting just Islamic before science. It's much more complex than that. But also, we have to bear in mind, we have to prioritize goals. Islam and science, of course, philosophically, you could spend all your life to engage with these kind of deep questions. But in schooling, in the pragmatic context, what is the really fundamental goal? Is to be able to enable diverse learners to develop knowledge, understanding of Islam, locate that knowledge in their lives and in the history, and then to be able to creative in that front. So we should really not to kind of lose sight of the priorities. And that is the task of obviously educational thinking, pedagogic planning, where we get these priorities right. And we obviously cater for Islamic higher education, where you have these complex, obviously, questions addressed at a high level. So in order to, how do we overcome this dichotomy of science, secular being, and Islamic? What is Islamic framework of scientific thinking? So here, obviously, there's plenty of literature going on, but I think we should not go into the easy option, simply turning Islamic past achievements like a museum and just be proud of. So false sense of confidence. It is not really the outcome the Muslims have produced. It is the fact that Muslims pose scientific questions in the first place. For example, when they engage with the Greek science, they actually pose the question, what is this awa'il, these ancients are talking about? Not only that they adopted this educational openness towards the Greek science and philosophy, but also to the heritage of Persia, India. The fundamental point is Islamic education in schools, in Darul Ulooms, in hybrid Islamic colleges, failing to revive this fundamental love, interest in posing scientific thinking, in posing questions, in challenging. That is actually what is really missing, I would say. And then we are just dealing with some outcomes, which is sadly falling into the false consciousness. We don't want to create really false sense of confidence. We want to be realistically engaging with the challenges, no matter how traumatic they are, without which we can't obviously move forward. So in terms of science and Islam, I would say time has arrived that we should prioritize scientific thinking, really. What they call scientific thinking is actually the Quranic way of thinking, questioning, posing, I suppose, challenging assumptions, and arriving at a level where you are certain, yaqeen. This kind of questions are really maybe modern, but actually the Quranic education pedagogy, what I call divine pedagogies, are giving us a framework. What we have lost is not much science outcomes, but scientific thinking, I would say, in the first place.
When you say scientific thinking, you're talking about an outlook that is inquisitive. So I think you're talking about something which is a popular perception rather than, of course, the sort of positivist prejudices that have characterized, unfortunately, a lot of disciplines, and not just in the sciences, but the humanities as well. And so, yes, I think, if I can add to what you've just said, which is, to a certain extent, we as an Ummah have also, sometimes for reasonable reasons, prioritized producing, scientists with our very best talent. Like all of our most talented people have ended up in the hard sciences. I myself was almost a victim of this, actually. I was going to be a doctor at one point in my life. But that, I think, is the lot for so many talented young Muslims, who then completely foreclose the possibility of even thinking about these sorts of questions. And I think, some of that intervention perhaps needs to happen on a society-wide level at an earlier stage of people's education, in a way that they don't have access to currently, unfortunately. But Jazakumullah khairan, all very important points for us to reflect on as we try and develop that kind of Ummatic consciousness. You cannot develop an Ummatic consciousness if you don't know knowledge, what ilm means. So barakallah fikum. I sorry, actually going to repeat one of the previous sort of questioners' secondary question, because it specifies the earlier question before. I hope I'm not we still have about 50 minutes, inshallah, so I hope I'm not going to miss out on too many other questions. But the earlier questioner was asking about, how do you deal with Islamic science? But then he was saying, what about more niche subjects? And I think this can maybe have a bit more of a narrow answer if you think that's useful. But niche subjects like material science or military science or quantum computing, which are either in the cutting edge of modern disciplines, something like quantum computing, or in the pragmatic edge of empire building military science, for example. So would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I mean, as I said, surely these are different types of knowledge genres. And in Islamic education, there is no real limit on that, because only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Alim, who has the all knowledge. So we only can really strive to acquire, and we have to make sure, of course, that knowledge genre has some sort of ethical endpoint. That is an important point. So clearly this is, what great scholars like Ibn Khaldun, Ghazali, they have mentioned that this is crucial, that knowledge doesn't become an ideological tool in the hands of few, I suppose, people. And it actually can demonstrate its public utility, if you like. Yes, there is fundamental personal interest, but also there is these specialisms that are obviously to do with the changing age. Islamic take on knowledge is so inclusive that actually it caters for all these developments. Now, the problem would be we are, because not at the forefront of the creating this knowledge, so we tend to be either emulators or consumers. So take artificial intelligence, AI. Of course, it's an important area of specialism, or computing science, military. Now, we can obviously, deal with these sciences, but it looks like we're always kind of dealing with these sciences a bit late. So therefore, we are reduced to emulators or simply borrowing, or, as I said, being consumers. What it is obviously to get forefront of knowledge creation. For this, you got to have an educational system in place where you are encouraged to be creative in the first place. So I would say still, it doesn't really matter, military science, artificial intelligence, if your education from primary school onwards is not nurturing inquiry, asking questions, but simply reproducing the same, the chances are none of these specialisms will make sense. You will simply be consumer without you knowing it. Take the notion of Islamic economics. I don't want to be criticizing, but last, 50 years, we hear this story of Islamic economics, this and that. Really, look at the Ummah. Still, we are in poverty. Economic infrastructure is not creating equality for all. Quality of life hasn't changed. What kind of Islamic economic system these scholars are producing in this new knowledge genre, where we have tangible evidence that is actually changing life? So, in other words, we do have some measures of judging how these different knowledge genres should be prioritized to be taught. And if there's no evidence suggesting that it could make a change, there's no point in dealing with that. And that is an important point. We got to have a critical awareness really inbuilt. And we do need, this is the word like jargon of empirical thinking. Empirical basically means what you can actually show as a demonstration, burhan, as an evidence basically, what classical Muslim scholars say. So we shouldn't really bog into these Western higher education scientific framing, said that they are misleading. And we need to return to the origins of these concepts. And if you go back to the Greeks, you will see the same thing. And so you have to look at what knowledge is really producing different specialisms is going to make a change in the real life and serve that public function is crucial. Otherwise, we will end up simply being consumers of newly developing different knowledge genres. But that is what we want to really avoid. I hope it's an answer.
I think this is very useful. I mean, basically going back to first principles in education, we need to always be capable of doing that. This is what, as you mentioned, Ghazali or Ibn Khaldun, this is what they do in their writings. They ask very fundamental questions. I guess, you're encouraging us to do that in the way that the great ulama of our past did. And that is really following this tradition. I'm going to try and keep my own interventions a bit quieter now because we have too many questions, basically. So I'm going to point out, someone was asking a very specific question. Maybe I'll bunch a couple of questions together. So someone's saying, what is the balance between the output of leadership and modeling through instruction based on prophetic traditions that can be developed into a universal model for application within any context? So balance between instruction and sort of a leadership model that is grounded in the Prophet's teachings, and kind of related to that, a couple of comments coming, I think, out of Dallas, Texas. So one person pointing out that there's excellent curriculum development. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the Yaqeen Institute, but I think it may be an allusion to that. But another person saying that the Islamic schools are severely underwhelming, and it costs $1,000 a month, but the students are miserable. So, I mean, you may wish to comment on your experience within the Islamic school sector as well. Sorry.
Well, yeah, obviously we have to bear in mind the fact that there are resource implications. Obviously, investing on time, resources are very crucial, and I understand that. particularly in the Muslim majority context of the West. Yes, we don't have infinite resources, obviously, to deal with this. So therefore, we do whatever is available to us. So what I'm asking for is whatever available to us can be turned into transformative space, really. And if we cannot do that, that is a really waste of resources and time. Now, Islamic schools, where I am based in the UK, is a massive sector. In fact, some of the Islamic schools are actually supported by the state. And this is across Europe. Now, the point is, just a simple question, those who are in the leadership position of this movement, why is it that 50 years of Islamic schooling, massive sector, why don't we even have a proper Muslim teacher trainings program in place? Why don't we have Islamic curriculum developed as such? So now that is, Islamic schools are like this. If you look at Islamic higher education, we have obviously traditional institutions, Darul Ulooms, and it's a bit unfair to expect sudden change or paradigm shift in that practice, because these are deliberately reproducing the same model, leadership models, as inherited from the mother institutions from India. Now, of course, we can debate whether this is creating ulama that we need today. It's a separate question. But that space itself is turned into, sadly, instruction and knowledge transmission, with the view that we have too much exposure to secular, Western ideas coming into it, is corrupting us, all the rest of it. But that space is also occupied. Now we have this curious third way, what I call the hybrid colleges, like I believe Yaqeen. There are several colleges in the UK, and there is one, of course, in the States. Now, unfortunately, if you look at the kind of curriculum they have, I would be hesitant to say they are actually capturing what we've been describing as inclusive, transformative vision of education, sadly. We have scholars who are expert on Islamic law, I don't know, Aqidah maybe. They're reproducing and reteaching the same. Less really we have space investing in specializing some of these colleagues there, brothers, sisters, who become also education experts. So ultimately, what they're producing is becoming imams, teaching Islam in the mosque madrasa. They all have an educational function. Why don't we have within this curriculum spaces for pedagogic Islamic education sciences, for example? And of course, if you go higher level, to what extent they are able to reconnect with Islamic higher sciences of the classical period, or today's social or humanities. I would say you can't really be qualified as a scholar unless you also have some literacy in social scientific thinking, humanities thinking. Unfortunately, it is impossible now to become an educational leader unless you have this, despite our criticisms. So I would say, Sufi leaning or reformist textual movements who are trying to recapture dynamism of Islamic higher learning in the modern age are very pious, good intended initiatives, but none of them are actually aware they need to invest in educational pedagogic experts in the first place, without which we can't read our tradition, neither we can guide these institutions. So we will end up really creating caricatures of the old, not being able to catch up with the modern, actually. This is what is happening. So I do teach, my courses are populated by graduates of Darul Ulooms. At least they get some traditional sense of Islamic Sharia sciences, although it's very limited. Sharia turned into a simple legal science, although Sharia is much more complex. We don't have time to unpack it. Sharia is the essence of Islamic worldview. It cannot be limited to fiqh or legal thinking. So you can actually reconfigure Islamic science around the concept of unfolding Sharia, which is ethics, value systems, all the rest of it. I've written about this as well. So unfortunately, with all due respect, really, I would say it is very disheartening to see these are all educational initiatives. None of these actually initiatives cater for specialisms on Islamic education or pedagogic sciences, sadly. And that tells us why there is no curriculum creativity, there is no pedagogic change in terms of how they teach and learn. And clearly, they try to emulate certain sub-traditions. I call this traditions of education in Islam. If you are in a Sufi-leaning guy, he will try to reproduce sort of Sufi-leaning type of Islamic higher learning. But this is not the way to go. Islamic heritage is for all of us to delve into it and benefit. We need an Islamic higher education where we don't give answers to young people. but we give them tools, skills, vision to explore by themselves complexity of Islamic legacy of intellectual genres. And that is not happening, unfortunately, sadly. And I'm saying that because I've worked in one of these, as Usama said, for nearly 8 years. So I'm not talking out of my depth here now.
Jazakumullah khairan. I would say that the recent initiatives by Yaqeen have been headed by people with doctorates or working in the realms of pedagogy specifically. And I think that there is promise, particularly in North America, where there's a lot more resources than, for example, in the UK, just the sorts of the demographic of Muslims who've ended up going there have been going to higher education and tertiary education, including doctoral degrees and so on. So they may have greater resources, but again, you need this combination of that level of educational expertise in contemporary pedagogical discourses alongside that in-depth familiarity with the Sharia discourses, which is more than just fiqh, as you pointed out, which is what it's been reduced to in the weaker of our institutions in the West. I think one paradox, which again, if you like, you can address this, but we have so many other questions that you can ignore this question for now, is that we're drawing on this category of education or pedagogy, which has the most developed thinking about this has been done in the West over the last 60 years or whatever it is. And so, but as you say, to be an alim in the modern world, you cannot disregard knowledges that have been developed in this way and globalized and inform the way in which we are taught on a global scale. So I take your point on that, but there's a paradox there as well, isn't there? Just to turn to so a couple of people have pointed out, I don't know if you have any comment on this, the Charter of Medina as an important document in thinking whether about being a watershed moment in exploring alternatives to the Islamic civilization could provide an alternative to nationalism, or as an inclusive document. I wanted to point out that one of the founders of Ummatics is actually quite critical of the use of this document in contemporary discourse. So Ubayma Anjum says that it's been misrepresented in ways. But if you'd like, you can comment on the importance of or otherwise of this document.
Surely the historical evidence behind the Medina Charter and its authenticity, what it actually means politically, these are always open, to debate and discuss. What is beyond debate is the fact that Quran has a very clear way of dealing with diversity of religions, ethnicities, cultures, even class, I would say, in this sense. So what really Medina Charter illustrates is an attempt, a prophetic leadership attempt to, I suppose, address a crisis of leadership in society where Muhammad ﷺ moved into it, and try to really make sure that this society is living up to the divine, I suppose, values, justice, or the kind of principles that the Quran is bringing that are new, transforming society. So I think this is beyond question without the fact that we go into the debates. And ultimately, of course, we know that Muhammad ﷺ was in the leadership position, but the fact is he was invited to Medina to actually make an arbitration between warring parties is in itself is enough evidence to say that the leadership education in Islam should produce the young leaders who are able to deal with diversity and difference, not dismiss it or not simply be threatened by it. And the point is, how do we actually manage this diversity in a creative way? This is exactly what has happened in social political context of 8th and 7th century Medina. So Islamic education really today has to be able to deal with diversity and difference, and to not allow intra-Ummah racism, phobias, exclusions to take place. And I say this because it's a reality as well. We have to be bearing in mind not only Muslims, Ummah is diverse, but we have, converts to Islam who bring a lot of new culture and knowledge to Islam. So in other words, what really the historic Medina Charter illustrates is, Islam dealing with socio-political economic problems in an inclusive manner, which is really the foundation of transformative Islamic educational vision, I would say. This is how Quran has tried to address the problem of Muslims, or in fact, society in Mecca. But that is a fundamental that we cannot really debate. We cannot say there are two ways about this. So I would say in this sense, yes, the prophetic model of leadership, educational leadership, which I believe Muhammad SAW had this distinctive self-awareness because he came out of the Quranic school of education, has this educational really underpinnings in his entire leadership practice. That includes political dimension, economic, in fact, spiritual, religious authority dimension. That kind of openness is really clearly visible. If only you can get this guiding us, our leadership training programs today, in getting young people who are actually going to be leaders, who are practicing such critical awareness and critical openness values. So I would say in this sense, yes, we do need, we can look at Muslims in Spain, historic examples, okay, maybe exaggerated, this whole Muslim scholars working with Christian, Jewish scholars, producing a kind of an integrated scholarship, enabling a Jewish scholar like Ibn Maymun, for example, to actually have confidence to redefine his faith, Judaism, by using Arabic language, Dala'il al-Hayrin. Now, we have no way to get close to this kind of open Islamic scholarship, sadly. What we have today is very caricaturized, very narrow, simplistic sort of, perception of knowledge and meaning of being educated, sadly. So in this sense, yes, we need to look at historical evidence, and we have to understand how the Quran in the first place implemented this transformative education that actually produced a new society. And this is exactly what we need today.
So, I mean, I had another thought, but I'm going to actually move on to a question. Perhaps we'll come back to this thought momentarily. I mean, let me first make this point, I suppose, which is that our education institutions, the very best educational institutions, are basically in the most powerful economic and military centers globally, military, political, economic centers globally. And I don't think that that's an accident. I think, the production of knowledge can, ideally, yes, knowledge is something which is about unbiased exploration, exploring the world. Our epistemology, our foundations might differ, but isn't it the case that the weakness that we have in our institutions and the production of our knowledge today is often a function? It shouldn't be used as an excuse to wallow in self-pity, but it's a function of Muslim political weakness on a global scale, Ummatic political weakness. And so, to what extent is, in your view, it important to rectify this through starting at the pedagogical end of the equation, and to what extent is it actually also about strengthening the military, economic, and political power end of that? And what are the risks? Is there a risk if you focus on the political strategy and all of those sorts of things and become powerful as a nation state, then you've got all the ideological baggage of the post-Westphalian order, the positivist global order. I'd love to hear your thoughts, somewhat briefly, perhaps.
Well, that's a good question. You know that you can guess my answer because I'm an educationist and pedagogue. So I would say that without creating a competent, dynamic, educational, pedagogic culture, infrastructure, none of the outcomes, political, military successes that we have today in the nation state, whatever you call it, Ummah, redefined by nation state, would really make sense. And I say this because we have examples of this. Look at post-revolution Iran, and look at Turkey, for example, which has success of last 20 years of actually putting into place some sort of Islamic confidence in dealing with these problems. In both cases, we can see that the education infrastructure remained sadly uninvested, hence remained poor. And therefore, of course, none of these high achievements that have temporarily gained remain in place. So I would say that I think the priority has been misunderstood, really. The question is, how do we initiate positive change, transformation? Well, the answer is, you got to get education infrastructure. This is exactly what the Quran did in 7th century Arabia. There's a wisdom behind Quran spending, 12 years, literally creating a new human being. Now, this is important, but then we have that question. Yes, everybody says education is important. We have to go to the next question. What kind of education? We don't want education reproduces the oppression and oppressiveness. We need really an education that actually moves on and transforms. That is exactly what the Quran did. And this is exactly, I would say, the contemporary Muslim Ummah, in it is majority and minority expressions need to prioritize, no matter how little resources we have. If you don't get the infrastructure right, we can't really cultivate this kind of dignified Islamic presence in the modern world. We will simply be still dependent on the wider power, I suppose, arrangements. Because if you look at this wider order, it has an underpinning educational infrastructure that is keep going and reproducing. We have lost our dynamic Islamic education infrastructure, and therefore we don't have scholars, intellectuals, I suppose, innovativeness. So we got to get this educational cultural rethought, honestly, and we should really address these pedagogies of taqlid to be, reconsidered. So I would say it's not a chicken and egg issue. I know it's a bit complex, but I think we got to get the priorities right. That doesn't mean you have to be unaware of the politics. Absolutely not. As you can see, political awareness is at the very heart of education in Islam. Full stop. It doesn't really matter about the success, but you got to have that awareness inbuilt. Without such awareness, education could become indoctrination, mere training, or simple instruction and transmission of knowledge, which is not going to produce autonomous, self-confident, dignified, really individuals, sadly. So I would say invest in Islamic education studies.
Barakallah fiik. No, absolutely. And, I think there is a lot for us to take from what you've just said, and, recalibrate our attitudes as an ummah, unfortunately, because we haven't done this. And we, as a result, arguably have been dealing with the same problems over and over again and expecting different results despite not changing our ways. I wanted to bring up a question of a past contributor to the colloquium, Dr. Hussam Muhammad, who is asking about, a series of challenging Western ideologies which are largely hegemonic, particularly in the West, for example. So how can concepts like secularism, nationalism, even Islamic nationalism, patriotism, citizenship, global citizenship be effectively taught to young Muslims in Western countries using their knowledge and applying critical approach? I guess, a critical approach to various concepts like this, which are so. So I'll leave it to you. What do you think?
Well, yes, we got to have, essentially thinking is made up of concepts, isn't it? Human beings think with concepts. So we need to give young people courage to obviously understand concepts, to contextualize these concepts, first of all. There's no point in dismissing them, being reactionary. This is not the really way forward. Nationalism, secularism, secular, these are key concepts that are actually, deriving modern world order, sadly. Now, young people, it's our duty, in fact, as parents, as teachers, we should be able to actually introduce young people to a critical education to these key concepts. That then, the point is, if you compare this with Islamic worldview, what do you make sense? So we have the duty of also introducing Islamic traditions. It's a very complex task, actually. What is happening now, either we are dismissing this Western concept, or we are simply becoming consumer of this concept. So critical education is the way forward, an Islamic critical education of foundational concepts driving modern world. And you'll be surprised to see how Muslim scholarship, Muslim tradition have already actually dealt with these complex questions. Again, what we don't have is this confident, open, critical education spaces, sadly. So somebody like Ibn Khaldun could, in pre-modern world, theorize sociologically, politics, education, civic societies of his day. Now, why is it that we are unable to produce young people, despite the fact that they go to and become sociologists, I don't know, they become psychologists in the Western sense, why they cannot really gain these skills to analyze Ummah's problems? So, in other words, because they are introduced to a secular version of these disciplinary developments, and young people don't have access to the tradition. So I would say we don't need to simply introduce young people to the Western vocabulary. We have to enable them to understand where these concepts are coming from, but also we have to give them really an Islamic, really equivalent of what has happened in the Islamic world. So this integrative, critical Islamic literacy is absent, I would say, with all due respect, despite the fact that we have even Islamic universities operating all over the place. And these are not prioritized, sadly. If you go to the Islamic universities, you will find emulation of the Western, I don't know, Yale, I don't know, whether Princeton, simply franchised. I mean, this is not the way you go and teach key concepts to Muslim young people who are living in a different context to understand this vocabulary. So in other words, it is lack of really critical Islam literacy, I would say, where young people are unable to contextualize modern concepts, not only in the secular sense, but also in the Islamic sense. So we do need to work out in the sense of an Islamic higher education curriculum where it does this critically comparatively based on knowledge. And that is probably the way forward.
So, I mean, to a certain extent, a lot of your work sits at the threshold of both theoretical and practical considerations. And so let me bring up a couple of practical questions that come up in this connection. Once again, things that you may have been asked in other contexts as well. Someone is saying, although this is, I think, a question directed at someone else, but I thought that this was it gives an interesting insight into practical challenges. Someone said your question on how to retain quality staff, with respect to, someone is asking basically in schools, how do you retain quality staff, maintain good income streams, produce revenue outside of tuition, and so on. How do you effectively create a sustainable institution while also thinking about questions of pedagogy? And I guess the question that I would want to derive from this comment in the chat is, there are different considerations to running institutions, whether at the level of higher education, like the one we both worked at in Markfield in the UK, or when it comes to teaching at school level. And a lot of the time we find this tension between the theorists, the theoreticians, and the practical administrators who have to deal with the very real question of, like, how do we keep this institution running? And I wonder if there's a tension there that we is worth reflecting on, even for those of us at the pedagogical end of that equation.
Sure. I mean, that is natural. Of course, these are day-to-day problems of running any institution. So you got to have an institutional leadership that is competent and able to channel all of these creativities that we are talking about. This is precise task of administration, isn't it, or management. Now, that is important. School improvement, school leadership, management, these are specialisms waiting for us. Again, really, there is no theory practice difference. I mean, look, Islamic tradition. I teach classical texts like Ibn Sahnun. He talks about how do you actually set up a madrasa and how do you run a kuttab. So this kind of really day-to-day problems of running an educational institutions and how to become a leader are actually quite integrated. We don't need to separate them. The sad thing is we don't have Muslim educational leaders who have administrative management skills, let us say, as well as an Islamic educational ethos that is dynamic. That is true. Therefore, we are stuck with this problem. And of course, lack of resources. Yes, that is very true. You've got to have resources to be able to finance this. This is the reality. But despite all of these limitations, I would say, I think the key thing is to invest heavily on the teachers. So the salaries, compatibility, satisfaction are crucial. And I work primarily with actually teachers, and I understand the limitations there. So if you cannot get the teachers becoming dynamic facilitators of change, even if you have the best schools, best management, the outcomes are really going to be disappointing. So we need, I would say, in all of these practical considerations, we need school administration, management prioritizing professional development of the teachers, particularly Islamic education teachers, which are least invested in. So if you go to an Islamic school, you will have a qualified maths teacher, science teacher. When it comes to Islamic education, Islamic studies, you will find really somebody who has even not basic pedagogic skills, because obviously there is no salary, not invested in. So sadly, these are the realities, harsh realities of the whole sector. But I would say it's not that actually poor, because I know that in the UK context, we have plenty of maintained schools where we have all salaries are covered by the state. Despite this, if you go and look at the Islamic school, you ask the question, what really makes the Islamic school distinctive? You don't get the answer. Do you teach Islamic literacy critically and contextually? Do children learn basic Arabic? Can they understand the Quran literacy? None of this. Do they develop faith development? So, in other words, we have to really revisit what we understand from Islamic school, Islamic university, and you will be amazed to see how the theory and practice goes hand in hand. But in all of this, I think Muslim educators are the ones we need to invest in, and we need to really prioritize.
So, I mean, in terms of investing in Muslim educators, in the UK, where you and I are from, we have a chronic problem of austerity. We're having an election basically on this issue to a certain extent, where there have been savage cuts to public services, including to teachers' salaries that have stagnated for probably over a decade at this point. And so a lot of people are leaving the teaching profession. Too much work, too little pay, huge amounts of stress, just not worth it. And one would expect, not universally now, as you've mentioned, some of the Islamic schools and that are supported by the state now are actually performing remarkably well in global in national rankings. Yet, there is a very challenging environment, and so, yeah, I mean, I wonder how one is supposed to sort of balance those considerations, because in practical terms, let me link this to a question from another person who has asked a previous question, Mukhtar Ola Kunle, but I think this is quite useful in light of what you just mentioned about the deficiencies of Islamic educational institutions. He's saying, would you recommend that someone goes to a Western university in order to gain a proper, thorough, critical understanding of knowledge? At least this is how I understand the question. A challenging question arises that where do people learn these skills if you're saying that these aren't being exemplified by our institutions? Because I assume you're not going to learn the Sharia very well in a Western university.
Yeah, well, that is a very valid question. Where do we get these skills? I would say, despite limitations, we have to ponder on the fact that why is it that we are unable to teach classical Arabic to our young people, even those who are going to be scholars and alims, whilst they spend 5-6 years studying Arabic? Why is it that the Orientalist school, I don't know, in Sorbonne, in Oxford, and in Princeton, can teach classical Arabic within just space of, I don't know, 1 year, to the point that you can actually engage with the classical texts? Of course, I'm not saying that, the kind of Orientalist study of Islam is going to give us what we need. Definitely not. But in terms of mere scholarship, we have something to learn. Why is it that today we are unable to teach these basic auxiliary sciences, for example? Now, of course, you can get a PhD from, I don't know, Oxford or Cambridge on Islamic studies, Orientalist studies. You could be expert on the Quran. One of the living legends of the Quranic studies, a German scholar, I forgot her name now, Angelika.
We have no idea.
Yes. For example, nobody could deny her scholarship on the Quran. In fact, the entire antiquity, she knows much more, you and I. But clearly, that scholarship is really limited in the sense that none of that would be really useful in terms of what we are looking for. What is the outcome of that scholarship? So clearly, going to a Western Islamic studies program might enable you in terms of academic scholarly practices that once Muslims were excelling in, by the way, and we are unable to teach today now in our so-called Islamic higher education institutions. But that is not enough, because you will end up, isn't it, becoming a kind of a subject experts, really, without none of the knowledge embodying your being. So here we go. The distinction is, in Islam, knowledge is supposed to be embodying the way in which you function. So if you delineate, if you uncouple that, that is a problem. That is actually, in fact, that you are making a major mistake of uncoupling epistemic, ontological sense of being educated, which is a problem of secular education, by the way. Now, I'm not advocating that, but clearly I cannot deny the fact that these institutions are teaching better than Muslims the infrastructure of basic scholarship techniques. Sadly, we have to acknowledge this. Now, that is not not the answer. We do need Muslim scholars who have already mastered these auxiliary sciences. Remember, Islamic higher curriculum has always been integrative. We have naqliyat, aqliyat, and aliyat. So it's a very simple way of measuring what is lacking today in our institutions. So without humanities, language, you can't, logic, Arabic, you can't really be a scholar as such at all. But that is not the end point. we are not going to produce simply people who publish papers. We need scholars who have intellectual, anguish and sense of responsibility as to how this knowledge is going to make a change to the Ummah. So that is recoupling epistemic ontological goals of education, which, as we said, it is an existential quest, really, can't be achieved into simply going to a Western university. Now, the alternative is you go to a Darul Uloom, you develop pedagogies of taqlid. That is also no good. So that is the whole part of the problem. How do we get actually this, reconnect with this integrative, holistic, transformative, take on the meaning of being learning and being a teacher or scholarship?
Can I mean, maybe draw a bit on my personal experience on this and ask you about yours? I mean, like yourself, but, you know, at an earlier stage in my life, I spent 4 years of my teenage years living in Jeddah, Saudi, in Saudi Arabia, studying in an English medium Islamic school, quote unquote. And then I came to the UK and I studied, did my undergraduate years at the University of Oxford, and I studied Islamic studies, as you know. And the sorts of teachers that were teaching in the so-called Islamic school, teaching Islam, very often they didn't even speak English very well. They were clearly quite incompetent, unfortunately. I mean, I say this with a certain amount of regret, and I don't mean to backbite anyone in particular, but just in the sense of everyone who was teaching a science or a discipline that was going to be examined in the international GCSEs was a highly qualified scholar, and everyone else was dispensable. And I think, you know, that's a reflection of probably parents' preferences as well, because they're more interested. Okay, when they say Islamic school, they're not talking about developing a critical pedagogical mindset. Like, these parents wouldn't be able to handle that from their own child, probably. Rather, they are saying, look, we just want people to be a bit disciplined. Sometimes they'll throw their children into this sort of school because they've gotten into trouble, they've gotten into drugs elsewhere. So maybe an Islamic environment where they have to pray dhuhr at 1 o'clock every day will help beat them into shape. That's the sort of attitude you're dealing with. When I went to a place like Oxford, I mean, I actually studied Arabic for a couple of years before I went to Oxford on 2 gap years. And my Arabic was actually better than most of my professors there, outside of the Arabic instructors specifically. And I actually think that it's not that they are teaching better critical skills because the system necessitates that. It's because, you know, as I said, in the Islamic environment, there's no incentive structure for people to teach Islam in a meaningfully critical and thoughtful way. And in the Western context, they do that anyway, even though they are deficient in their linguistic abilities, because, you know, a lot of my teachers had never set foot for more than a couple of weeks in an Arabic country. They're pure book learners. They have no holistic understanding of Islamic culture in many cases. My colleagues now at Oxford are, you know, of a different generation and a bit more cosmopolitan in that sense. And so I don't mean to denigrate my sort of colleagues or my professors at Oxford, from whom I learned a lot, but I don't think that you know, what they taught was particularly more sophisticated than what I studied in a Darul Uloom setting. I also had the opportunity to study with Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadwi at the As-Salam Institute, which is a part-time Darul Uloom, and subsequently I taught there. And I think the sophistication of knowledge that I got from someone like Muhammad Akram Nadwi was far superior than anything I studied really at an undergraduate level at Oxford. So I wonder, like, where is the mismatch here? You know, I don't think it's straightforwardly critical thinking belongs in the university, uncritical thinking belongs in Muslim sort of institutions. Yeah, sorry, very long question. Apologies.
No, well, clearly we need to replicate more of these kind of successful models. But we are talking about by and large. You know, we are not obviously idealizing or simply criticizing one model. But the fact is, there are techniques of scholarship, pedagogic techniques of scholarship that are universal in a way. And I gave example, isn't it, how Muslims have advanced this. It is not particularly Western or Eastern. Love of learning. How could you essentialize this to a nation or a race or a place? No, you can't do that. Any nation who actually cultivates and nurtures love of learning, they're going to have young people who are going to be looking after seeking knowledge. Now, in our case, unfortunately, because we have a very complex legacy inherited, we have to bear in mind, we are kind of frightened, we feel intimidated by the complexity, bigness of our heritage. Young people are not confident, in fact, to engage with this. What is missing by and large in Darul Uloom, even Islamic hybrid colleges are supposed to be bridging that gap, is the fact that you got to have skills in humanities, in social sciences, textual studies to be able to bridge that gap. For example, how could you have a course called Contextual Islam where we don't teach critical historical thinking skills, for example? So these are obviously not essentialized in any way, but the fact is, our institutions of higher education, traditional or hybrid, are really failing to communicate, build this infrastructure, pedagogic infrastructure, which will enable young people to locate, contextualize knowledge that they are engaging with. It won't be a simple emulation, memorization, transmission, which by and large is happening. And of course, there are always exceptions to this rule. What we need is an egalitarian system where all of our ulama and alims have the benefit of developing these skills. And then, of course, hence engaging with the tradition confidently, yet with awe and respect, but nevertheless scholarly. You can't really simply always have a devotional attitude. You got to have this devotion and criticality, in a sense, integrated, and that is what
Yes.
Islamic scholarship did best. In fact, it's clear, and this is what we have lost. So we have to get this infrastructure really well built in these institutions, and we have to trust the young people. The problem is these institutions that are so ideologically colored, in fact, the output before even these young people go there. How could this be Islamic higher learning? Higher learning is essentially to do with developing young minds who are creative, can find their own voice, become independent. Remember the ijtihadi kind of mindset, not in the sense of legal creativity, but ijtihad here, it means pedagogic educational dynamism. Why young people spend 5 years to just become their sheikh? This is not the point. You can benefit from your sheikh, but scholarship means you are able to actually find your own voice. Therefore, we have ta'liqa tradition, where classical scholars kept personal notes throughout their studies in the madrasa or with their teachers. But finally, they put all the ta'liqa together to produce their own unique synthesis. Most of Imam Ghazali's creative books are based on these ta'liqas, where he took the notes, but he also built on it to develop his own unique perspective on the issues. So that's put together. So unfortunately, we are unable to build this kind of scholarly infrastructure, pedagogic confidence, criticality in place. And therefore, of course, we have to be fair and say, well, yes, just like Osama, if you go to Princeton, you will add on to your Islamic knowledge with critical, political literacy, for example. Or if you go to Oxford, you will learn X, Y, Z. But these are not, of course, the ideal solutions because they all come with the baggages
Absolutely.
of Orientalism, of limitations of reducing Islam into a caricaturized past obsession. This is obviously not what we want, definitely. But in between is a scholarship techniques, pedagogic techniques that are inevitable, that are vital for both Muslim and non-Muslims to share. But the outcomes, of course, is not what exactly we want from this Western higher education, where obviously the way in which they are reducing the knowledge to exploitation means basically, colonial administration, expansion, globalization, and essentially westernization, and the killing off at the cost of killing all indigenous wisdom traditions. This is not what we are advocating, definitely. But what cannot be denied is scholarship has its own techniques, and these are quite universal in many ways. And if you are excelling on this, the chances are you will actually excel in terms of knowledge leadership, thought leadership, and you can actually make the knowledge positively change yourself and, of course, the world that you're living in.
Barakallah feekum. I mean, I really appreciate the fact that the sort of synthesis that you're talking about would be recognized as, Islamic scholarly excellence in both the East and the West, right?
Sure.
And that's the ultimate goal. I did want to add, and feel free to comment on this or not, but unfortunately, I find myself a lot of the time putting that blame on our communities that have decided not to prioritize this as a concern. All of our best talent, I mean, they're the ones who, send often our least talented people to study Islam. And, I think I may have mentioned this anecdote in a previous Ummatics Colloquium, but my grandfather, who was rahmatullahi alayhi, a great Islamic scholar, was once asked by someone very insolently that, why are all these Maulvis such buffoons or idiots, like they're uneducated? And at the end of that conversation, the person admitted that his least talented child he sent to become a Maulana. Everyone else was more talented, so he sent them to, you know, proper medicine or engineering or something along those lines. And that, just a lack of you know, true commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen, I think it's reflective of that, is what is ailing us in so many respects. I wanted to perhaps maybe make this my final question from the audience. Thank you so much for your participation. I found a bit of difficulty from some of these questions because you were talking to each other as well. So this I can draw out as a question from someone called Brahim Leitus, saying, I'm the director of IDARA, European Development and Research Academy in Belgium, asking if we can start with scholars and educators in Europe to discuss and implement this sort of a paradigm shift in a European conference here in Brussels. And I think, Dr. Abdullah, you'd be more than happy, I'm sure, to participate in this. And I would encourage Ibrahim Leitus, if I've pronounced your name correctly, I hope, to get in touch with Dr. Abdullah Shaheen through his Warwick sort of email address. And, you know, I think this is precisely the sort of Ummatic conversation we want to promote in a way that will bring us that intellectual authority and spiritual development, so crucial, that you mentioned something which is highly neglected in Western sort of pedagogical methods, because we need to embody our tradition. Spiritual development to sort of contemporary Islamic practice. Dr. Abdullah, we've come to time, but in the last minute or two, would you like to add any other reflections or any concluding thoughts before we conclude?
Well, yes, as I expected, I think this encounter has turned into a good experience of ta'aruf. I think reflections and questions, and thank you for all of those who are listening to us patiently. Really enriched, in fact, gave me confidence for a start to carry on what I do. And I hope that this has inspired all of you to do something different. And if you're involved in education and Islam, and definitely if you're thinking of problems of the Ummah, this is really the platform. So I'm very pleased with Ummatics kind of platform. I can see there are synergies, and I'm very pleased to see that education, Islamic education, is also taken up as an area of discussion within these wider debates. So it's really thanking you and the host and all of the listeners. All I have to say is we have to really work hard to reconnect with this transformative, inclusive, integrative Islamic education traditions. This is so vital for Ummah to regain its lost consciousness, awareness of its mission and duty. And without such a critical educational presence, none of the ideals, dreams we have could be achieved. We might end up with false consciousness, sadly. So we need this in place in all our institutions. And despite the fact that we've been critical of these institutions, but they are ultimately our institutions. Islam is always, as I said, one meaning of Tarbiyah is Islah, that is continuous reform. Ultimately, they are our institutions. We are grateful for those who have set up these institutions, Islamic schools, Darul Ulooms, Islamic hybrid colleges. We need to build on this wonderful work, but we have to realize that now we have to prioritize as an area of specialism these developments. And in this sense, really my work in Islamic education studies at Warwick is open to all collaboration. And we do have a summer school every year. I invite colleagues to join in. Usually it's a 1 week exposure to the Islamic really model of education in Islam. And also we have various other platforms, research, a continuing doctorate program in Islamic education, and interest in how do we actually get Islamic theological leadership, faith leadership, education reinstitute within this radically different new context. So please do get in touch, and we have to really bring efforts together to achieve something. But I'm very pleased that Ummatics is actually a platform to forward these conversations. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dr. Abdullah Shaheen, I really have nothing to add. That was a wonderful conclusion to this entire panel. And we ask everyone to pray for the Ummatics project and for scholars like Dr. Abdullah, who are really making those Ummatic interventions. Sometimes we're not aware of them, and this is an opportunity, inshallah, as Dr. Abdullah was saying, for ta'aruf. And we hope to see you in a future colloquium. We have these on a monthly basis, inshallah. And we welcome, as Dr. Abdullah will have heard and others will have heard, scholars' interventions throughout these sorts of engagements as well, from the questioners as well as, of course, from the panel. So with that, I will conclude. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.